behind the glass. The first time, Officer Reyes pressed her hand against the cold reinforced glass of the visitation window. She told herself it was a professional gesture, a gesture of reassurance toward an inmate who had just received news that her mother had passed away somewhere outside those walls, in a world that had kept moving without her. She told herself that the tears forming in her own eyes were simply the natural human response to witnessing grief in its most raw, unfiltered form. She told herself a lot of things in those early weeks, but the heart has never been particularly good at listening to reason, and the heart of Officer Daniela Reyes was no exception. Mariana Castillo had arrived at the Westbrook Correctional Facility on a Tuesday in late November, her wrists in restraints, her eyes carrying the particular kind of emptiness that belongs to people who have lost everything in a single moment. She had been convicted on a charge that many in the community still debated in hushed corners and online forums in a financial crime. Committed in desperation, a single terrible decision made to save her younger sister from a mounting debt that had turned dangerous. The judge had called it fraud. People who knew her called it sacrifice. The system, as it always does, had proceeded without much interest in the nuance between the two. Mariana had walked through those heavy steel doors carrying nothing but a thin manila envelope of personal items and the quiet dignity of someone who had already made peace with a punishment she did not entirely believe she deserved, but had chosen to accept rather than fight any longer. Daniela had been working at Westbrook for 6 years by then. She had learned to build the necessary walls, not cruel walls, but professional ones. She had learned to see the women in her charge as people worthy of dignity, without allowing herself to become emotionally entangled in their stories. She was known among the staff as fair, firm, and quietly compassionate. She was known among the inmates as someone who remembered birthdays, who slid books under cell doors without being asked, who never raised her voice when a lowered one would accomplish the same result. She was, by every measure, exactly the kind of officer that the system rarely produced and even more rarely retained. Their first real conversation happened by accident. The way the most important conversations often do. Daniela had found Mariana sitting alone in the facility library, 3 weeks into her sentence. Not reading, not sleeping, simply sitting with her hands folded on the table in front of her, staring at the grain of the wood as though she were trying to memorize it. There was something in the stillness of her that made Daniela pause in the doorway rather than continue her rounds. She had seen women angry, women broken, women defiant, and women resigned. She had rarely seen a woman so completely, so painfully present in her own devastation. She stepped inside. She sat down across the table without asking permission. She said nothing for a long moment, and then, because it was the truest thing she could offer, she simply said that she was sorry about her mother. What followed was not a single dramatic moment of connection, but rather a slow, quiet accumulation of small ones. It was the way Mariana began to look up from whatever she was doing when she heard Daniela's footsteps in the corridor. It was the way Daniela began to notice which books Mariana had checked out and leave related titles nearby as though by coincidence. It was conversations through the library window about literature, about the particular cruelty of love lost to circumstance, about what it means to carry guilt that is only partially your own. It was the gradual, terrifying realization that they were not simply two people being kind to each other across a professional boundary. They were two people falling slowly and irrevocably into something that had no safe name inside those walls. Daniela fought it the way a person fights a tide, which is to say she fought it exhaustingly and without any real success. She reminded herself of the regulations, the ethics, the professional consequences. She reminded herself of the power imbalance, the impossibility of genuine consent in a space defined by confinement and authority. She requested a schedule change and then quietly reversed it when the request was approved, telling herself it was because the new shift would interfere with her other obligations, knowing in the part of herself she was less willing to examine that she simply could not make herself walk away. She began keeping a private journal, pouring into it every conversation, every glance, every moment of connection she was not permitted to acknowledge out loud, as though writing it down might drain it of its power over her. Instead, it only made it more real. Mariana, for her part, had not expected to feel anything during her time at Westbrook except the slow, grinding passage of days. She had built her own walls from different materials than Daniela's, built from grief and guilt and the specific loneliness of a person who believes she has forfeited her right to be loved. She had loved before, had been in relationships that taught her more about her own capacity for love than about love itself, had arrived at Westbrook certain that whatever softness she once possessed had been calcified by the events that brought her there. And yet there was Daniela, appearing in doorways and leaving books without fanfare and sitting across from her in silence, as though silence were a gift rather than an absence. There was Daniela, who looked at her not with pity, which Mariana could not have endured, but with a kind of careful open recognition, as though she were seeing her in full and finding the view not just acceptable but something closer to remarkable. The crisis came on an ordinary evening in March, which is when crises typically choose to arrive. A routine inspection of the library revealed a folded note that had fallen from between the pages of a borrowed book, and nothing explicit, nothing that crossed the clearest lines, but enough. A few written words between them, words that any outside observer would recognize immediately as the language of two people who had allowed themselves to feel far more than they were supposed to feel. Daniela was called into her supervisor's office. The conversation was professional, measured, and devastating in the way that only institutional consequences can be. She was not immediately terminated. The note did not contain enough to justify that, but she was formally warned, transferred to a different wing, and made to understand in terms that left no room for misinterpretation that her career, her pension, and her freedom depended on the absolute cessation of whatever it was that had been developing in that library. She did not see Mariana for 11 days. Those 11 days were among the longest of her life, not because she was in physical pain, though in some ways she was, but because she had been forced to confront in those days without distraction the full weight of what she felt and the full impossibility of what it meant. She thought about Mariana waking up in her cell and reaching for a book and finding no new one waiting. She thought about Mariana looking toward the library door and not seeing the familiar shadow of her in the corridor. She thought about loneliness as something one person could accidentally become the antidote to for another person, and she thought about what it meant to withdraw that antidote without warning. She thought about the difference between protecting someone and abandoning them, and she was not always certain she knew which side of that line she stood on. When they finally saw each other again, it was across the open space of the facility's outdoor yard during a scheduled recreation hour, and they were surrounded by dozens of other women and at least 4 other officers, and nothing passed between them, except a single glance that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds was everything: acknowledgement, grief, gratitude, the specific ache of two people who understand each other completely and completely understand why they cannot be what they are to each other in this particular place and time. Daniela looked away first. It was the professional thing to do. It was also, she decided later, the most loving thing she had done in a long time. There are stories that end in union and stories that end in separation, and both can be true and both can be beautiful, and the most honest stories understand that some connections do not require conventional resolution in order to have been profoundly real. Daniela put in for a transfer to a facility across the state 4 months later, not running but making room. She completed her transfer with her record intact and her career preserved and a hollow place in her chest that she did not rush to fill. She began writing, something that was not quite a memoir and not quite a confession, something in between, something for herself. Mariana served the remaining 14 months of her sentence with the quiet resilience she had always possessed, and was released on a Thursday morning into the pale winter light, carrying the same thin manila envelope with a few more items in it than before, including a book of poetry that had appeared on her pillow on her last night inside, with no name written inside the cover, which was somehow the most eloquent signature possible. They did not reunite in the parking lot. There was no cinematic moment of 2 figures running toward each other across an open space. Life is rarely that generous with its timing. But Mariana stood on the sidewalk, outside the facility for a long moment before she got into her sister's waiting car, and she looked back at the building that had held her and taken from her and, in one bewildering and indelible way, also given to her something she had not expected to find there. She pressed her hand briefly to her own chest, not dramatically but privately, the way you touch a bruise to confirm it was real. Then she got in the car. The car pulled away. The building receded in the window behind her. She opened the book of poetry in her lap and read the first line. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something in her uncurl like a fist slowly, carefully choosing to become an open hand. If you have ever loved someone in a space where love was not supposed to exist, if you have ever felt something true in circumstances that made truth inconvenient, then this story is for you. Take a moment right now, while this feeling is still sitting with you, to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because it means you believe that stories like this one deserve to be told. And before we close, and drop a single word in the comments below that describes what you felt while listening to this story. Just one word. That word will tell us everything we need to know about why we keep telling these stories, and why you keep coming back to hear them. Some loves are not built to last in the conventional sense. They are built instead to change us, to reach into the part of us that had closed itself off and remind us, firmly and tenderly, that we are still capable of feeling the full weight of another person. Daniela and Mariana never sat across a dinner table from each other. They never walked down a street holding hands or built a life inside the same four walls. What they built was something quieter and in its own way, more durable. The knowledge that they had been truly seen by another human being, in the most unlikely place at the most unlikely time. And that being seen like that, even briefly, even impossibly, is not nothing. It is in fact everything.